afternoon. Well, it's morning, but it'll be afternoon very shortly. And I'm Richard Vobes, the Bald Explorer. I'm going to have another stab. I tried to do this morning, and it's a Monday morning, and I don't know, had a bit of a stumble with the text, couldn't read it, felt very embarrassed, and I stopped fairly swiftly and consequently deleted it. So I thought I'd have another stab and see if the brain is working. Maybe I was just a bit tired. So I'm reading The English Journey, or just English Journey it is, by J.B. Priestley. On chapter 3, Into the Cotswolds, and yeah, I've decided. Hello, Lisa and Audrey. I've decided to. I was just in a bit of a black mood, I think, today, realising another week we've got to try and keep ourselves occupied, and yeah, I just felt a bit grim. So I'm going to try another go. So here we go. It's a lovely day out there. Just we're not allowed to go out and enjoy it. Right. So chapter 3, Into the Cotswolds, and we're halfway through chapter 3. I dined that night with a friend, a good artist and a Cotswold enthusiast, and we soon fell to arguing when the table had been cleared and our smoke clouded the candlelight. He is a Catholic, a medievalist, a craftsman who would have all craftsmen, a thorough hater of everything modern. He has no telephone, of course, but he does not scruple to use the one across the way, detests motor cars, but jumps into one readily enough to show you his beloved Cotswold. Living where he does, he has some foundation for his opinions. He has lived in the Cotswolds for 30 years, ever since he ceased to be an art student, and during that time he has watched the decay of older craftsmen who were educated in their trade and in no other way. Men like old George the mason, men who were not only superb workmen, who would scorn to do a bad job, but also solid lumps of character with an earthy humour and sagacity about them. And he has seen their places taken by young men who had not the tenth of skill or character, who were half-hearted about their work or play, mass children of a machine age. All our labour troubles, he declared, did not come from a quarrel about the distribution of profits, but from a deeper cause, the crushing of the workman's self-respect by mechanical labour, in which he could not find himself. He would have everything made by hand again, restore the craftsman and banish the machine, replace the trade union by the guild, with its insistence upon high standard of workmanship. And if that meant doing without a lot of things, then we must do without them. He himself had built his own house and was doing without a great many little comforts and conveniences, presumably because he had not yet been able to have them made by hand. It was a point of view I could respect and understand. If I'd been an artist and craftsman, living as he'd done in the Cotswolds, I should have held such views. As it was, of course, I opposed him, pointing out that comely objects in a museum and a rich man's house gave one a very faulty notion of the actual life of the past, when most people had to do without nearly everything, and were far less merry than he appeared to suppose, that machines, rightly used, simply did away with a horrible dead weight of miserable toil, and that anyhow a machine was not the bogey thing he seemed to think it was, but really an elaborate tool, and that our business now was not to sentimentalise the Middle Ages, but to take the whole roaring machine-ridden world as it is and make a civilised job of it, using mechanical power when it suits us. And the changeover from the steam to electrical power gives us far more freedom. And then our hands, though not mine, God help them, when the work or or use our hands when the work or our inclination called for them. The machine itself, I said, is not at fault, being merely our dumb slave, but the shoddy, greedy, profit-grabbing, joint stock company industrial system that we've all allowed to dominate us. That was the real villain. We had to civilise it. This could not be done, in his opinion. He disliked all our ways. He asked me to share his contempt with the new urban mob, the products of industrial towns and free education at council schools and cheap books and so on and so forth. But as I considered myself one of these very people, I had to decline. He remembered seeing something about the end of the war, a battalion of Sherwood foresters arrive at some place in Southern Ireland where he was staying, and he said that compared with the Irish peasants, these city-bred troops looked and behaved like a lot of monkeys. To this I replied that I had fought with such troops in the war, and was willing to bet that they had more courage, intelligence, eagerness, chivalry, humour, irony than any peasants, Irish or otherwise. There came a moment when it looked as if we were about to quarrel, but we laughed at the right second, drank to the Cotswolds, and parted better friends than ever. There is not, I imagine, much distress anywhere in this region. The men on the land are not well paid, but they can live out their wages. They can live on their wages. People looked comfortable there. The children were noticeably in good shape. The towns are without those squalid patches you often find in country towns. The average standard of life in these parts must be fairly high. It would be interesting to know how much money from outside has been spent in the Cotswolds, partly to preserve the unique charm of their domestic architecture. In no other part of the country do you see large tracts of land, beautiful old England, still unspoilt. What will happen to it? At the moment, especially in the northern half, it is probably in less danger of being spoiled than it has ever been during the last 20 years, thanks to a ceaseless vigilance of certain persons, mostly settlers from outside. But one never knows when danger may threaten again, and once the Cotswolds are ruined now, they are ruined forever. A few spaces, such as Dover's Hill, have been acquired by the National Trust. But this is not enough. We need to take the whole of that exquisite countryside and lay it on our consciences. It could be turned into a sort of national park, and by that, of course, I do not mean a playground or mere picnicking place, for the mere size and the region makes such a proposal absurd, but a district that, regarded as a national heritage of great value, is controlled by the Commonwealth and, so far as is possible, acquired by the nation itself, which would not, however, turn away people who work the land. This was written in 1933, by the way, and it's interesting to note that places like the Peak District and the South Downs have been turned into national parks. That's quite an interesting observation that J.B. Priestley makes. It would be an interesting question of control and responsibility. The beauty of the Cotswolds belongs to England, and England should see that she keeps it. Even if the church ceased to exist tomorrow, we should not allow Salisbury Cathedral to be turned into a filling station, and we must see that nobody is allowed to carve and tinker and daub away at these hills and their enchanting villages. I, for one, should like to see a good many people like my ferocious friend the artist making their homes in the region as guardians of its traditions, and if necessary, as experimenters in a mode of life governed by these traditions. After all, we need such experiments in life rather badly now, when everything and everyone is being rushed down and swept into one dusty arterial road of cheap mass production and standardised living. It may be necessary to banish from these hills the grimmer realities of our economic life, to make it artificially secure in its fairy tale of grey old stones and misty valleys. But even then, though no argument of my friend's will be tested and proved, though he himself may be the last to be maintained in a quiet ease by the labour of machines, banished from his sight and hearing, the move will be worth the making. There will remain a countryside that we will be able to give both body and spirit a holiday, and that may yet offer our minds material out of which we can conjure for our grandchildren a way of life better than the dirty hotchpotch of today, and better than the yesterday of those anonymous masons have here glorified and flattered for us. That way of life will, I trust, banish all Church of England. That way of life, I trust, will banish all Church of England clergymen with booming voices and preposterous accents. In my Cotswolds hotel, I could not escape the noises made by one of those gentlemen, who was ridiculous as any music hall parody of the type. "As a matter of fact," he would say, "we talked of many, many things." And he himself talked of many, many things, all over the hotel, and the rest of us had to listen whether we wanted to or not. How is it that a church, how is it that a church that has such a legacy of superb prose, out of which half our good literature has come flowering, still encourages these comic but irritating fellows to be its spokesmen and priests? What God is this that booms at us so idiotically? Certainly not one for whom these Cotswold churches were raised, and for whose glory old George the Mason still builds a noble dry wall. We're now on chapter 4. Nice to see Mark Selwood there. Les Jest, good morning. Mark Selwood, did Richard have problems reading last night? Yeah, I did. It was in the morning. I read at 9:30 in the morning, but I did have problems. I just was stumbling over the words. Not quite sure why. Sometimes you just do. Actually, it's freezing cold in here. Let's put the heater on. Right, chapter 4, to Coventry, Birmingham, and the Black Country. My plan was to go from the Cotswolds to the Black Country, but I decided not to go straight to Birmingham, but to make a little detour and first visit Coventry, a city I did not know at all. The weather was all wrong. As I left the glorious pastures of the Cotswolds and turned my face towards the Black Country, the sky should have darkened. As it was, I had a brilliant morning for my little cross-country journey, and the nearer I drew to Coventry, the better it became. When I actually arrived there, late in the morning, there was not a single shred of cloud in the sky, an exquisite luminous azure. Everything was crystal clear. Not an outline anywhere had the faintest blur. The brick walls, full in the sun, might have been newly painted by Vermeer. Distant factories, rigidly defined in the 3 dimensions, had a Cantaletto quality. Things near at hand, a passing bus, a big yellow poster, dazzled and hurt my eyes. Coventry itself, ancient steeples and motor car factories and all, was stated so emphatically against the green hollow and the silken sky that to see it gave one a sharp jolt of pleasure. There was the famous old city of 3 steeples, and the equally famous new city of bicycles and motor cars and wireless sets, and all so clear that it might have been transported into Italy. This was all wrong. I had been prepared for a dull day and gloomy vistas, and was ready to overhaul my stock of sombre adjectives. I felt I could not cope with this unexpected brightness. The bedroom they gave me at the hotel was true to form, being the usual inhuman little box lined with stained wallpaper and containing no running water. The window looked out onto a blank brick wall, but the brick wall was fiery hued, and the water pipe running down it had just been painted a bright green, and so the effect was that of a bold picture by some modern. I had a mind then to dodge the town, not say a word about having been there, but honesty won, though the victory will not prove to be a spectacular one. Coventry is one of those towns that have often changed their trades and have many vicissitudes, but unlike nearly all the rest, it has managed to come out on top. In the 13th century it was making cutlery, in the 14th cloth, in the 15th gloves, in the 16th buttons, in the 17th clocks, in the 18th ribbons, in the 19th sewing machines and bicycles, and now, in the 20th, motor cars, electrical gadgets, machine tools, and wireless apparatus. You may judge how artfully it has backed its fancy by following the figures. In 1901, its population was 69,978, and its estimated population for this year, 1933, is no less than 182,000. Figures that suggest that the city has got lost in time and imagines that the Industrial Revolution is in full force. In the centre of the city, I found ample remains of the cutlery, cloth, button, clock and ribbon periods scattered about, now oddly mixed up with lions, cheap tailors, Ronald Coleman, cut-price shops, berries and loudspeakers. It's genuinely old and picturesque. The Cathedral of St Mary's Hall, Ford's and Bablake Hospital, Butcher's Row and the Old Palace Yard. I mean, if you peep round a corner and see half-timbered and gabled houses that would do for a second act of the Maistsinger. In fact, you could stage the Maistsinger or film it in Coventry. I knew it was an old place, for wasn't there a Lady Godiva? But I was surprised to find how much of the past in soaring stone and carved wood still remained in the city. Though even here, in the centre, the two buildings that dominated the rest are new and enormous bank offices, very massive and Corinthian, and designed to suggest that there is nothing wrong with our financial system. If you do not understand why our banks give so little interest on our loans to them and demand so much more in interest on their loans to us, or why they are encouraged for private profit to exchange mere credit for solid buildings and machinery and business at work, then you should go and have a look at these colossal white stone pillars of theirs in Coventry. Perhaps they will reassure you that is what they are there to do. These picturesque remains of old Coventry are besieged by an army of nuts, bolts, hammers, spanners, gauges, drills, and machine lathes. For in a thick ring around this ancient centre are the motor car and cycle factories, the machine tool makers, the magneto manufacturers, and the electrical companies. Beyond them again is a whole new quarter where the mechanics and the fitters and turners and furnace men live in neat brick rows and drink their beer in gigantic new public houses to take their wives to gigantic new picture theatres. Tennyson, in his poem about Godiva, that begins so uncharacteristically, "I waited for a train at Coventry," must have foreseen all this, for does he not mention new men that are in... I'm never good at reading poetry. New men that in the flying of a wheel can cry down the past. New men that in the flying of a wheel cry down the past. Here are the new men and the flying wheels. Coventry seems to have acquired the trick of keeping up with the times, a trick that many of our industrial cities find hard to learn. It made bicycles when everyone was cycling, cars when everybody wanted a motor, and now it's busy with aeroplanes, wireless sets and various electrical contrivances, including the apparatus used by the talkies. There is still plenty of unemployment here, about 12,000 I believe, but as I write, the place has passed its worst period of depression, and unless this country reels back into a bottomless pit of trade depression, Coventry should be all right. Factories that were working on short time a year or two ago are now in some instances back on double shifts. I saw their light and heard the deep roar of their machinery later that night. My own car, a Daimler, was made in this city, so after lunch I went out to see how they did it. I climbed a hill, and there, just over the summit, were the Daimler works, like a young town of long brick sheds. I was given a guide, an intelligent young engineer, who took me first to the laboratory where a number of men were enjoying themselves, testing various samples of metal. I took a hand myself in testing the hardness of a small metal part with a diamond point, which was connected to an indicator showing the degree of resistance in exact figures. In other rooms, there were bubbling test tubes and enlarged microscopic slides of sections of metal. In manufacturing of motor cars, the metal's the thing, and it seems they're very scientific about it. I was then taken through various huge sheds in which hundreds and hundreds of mechanics were at work, making and testing parts. There were about 4,000 men employed here. All these sheds were the same, a long vista of blue electric light shades, a misty perspective of flywheels above, and brown overalled men below. They were all hard at it, and most of them were having a smoke too, for they were allowed to smoke for 3/4 of an hour in the morning and in the afternoon, a wise rule. Every man in these departments was limited to one job, but there was a certain amount of variety inside the job. This was not strictly mass production. There was no endless moving chain. There were no men restricted to putting on a bolt here and a nut there. It was highly organised, large-scale jobbing production. Its size, my guide told me, was in its favour because parts were put through tests that would be impossible in a tiny workshop. A manufacturer in a small way could not afford to use the various machines necessary for these tests, such as the machine I watched with interest, which tested the exact balance of one of the flywheels and showed exactly where there was still a fraction of too much metal on some segment. One had the impression of a most rigorous testing everywhere. The idea now is to cut down the preliminary trials of the finished car outside the factory, so the various parts, engine, gears, crankshafts, axles, are ferociously tried out before they are assembled. The modern motor car represents an astonishing feat of human ingenuity. Consider the number of them on the roads and the extraordinarily few accidents due to any fault of the vehicle itself. If we were one half so clever in the matters that lie far outside machinery as we are about machinery itself, what people we would be and what a world we would leave for our children. If life were only an internal combustion engine, the skill and the care that are lavished on these cylinders and pistons and gears. I've no doubt that boys and girls in Coventry are comparatively well looked after, but nobody has attended to them as their fathers are attending to the proud young 66 Daimlers. There's a bus department in these works. I was allowed to see the giant steel entrails of these creatures. 2 very fine specimens had just been completed, and my guide and I explored them. Inside the top deck and the driver's seat where you suddenly feel very powerful. One of these grand new fellows, immensely powerful and roomy and ready to take you anywhere with its 40 horses, costs between £1,500 and £2,000. It would be a good idea, I said, to have one as a private car. It would be a better idea, I continued, to buy one and then rig it up as a caravan. As usual, I was not being original. The thing had already been done. An ingenious sportsman had commissioned a caravan bus with sitting room, 2 bedrooms, kitchen and bath. I envy him. I ought to have one for this journey. Then I could travel amusingly and comfortably and be free of these beastly hotels. The only trouble is, I imagine that a great many of the roads must be closed to buses of this size, which are at once very high and very heavy. But I've no doubt that you could travel fairly easily in one, at about 9 miles to the gallon, with your family or some friends abroad, from Land's End to John O'Groats. I commend the notion to anybody who has a couple of £1,000 to play with and thinks that he could drive a bus. And the young man from the Daimler's Works, who had driven everything, assured me that once you are familiar with the enormous length of a bus, and at first it must seem like turning a row of cottages round a corner, it's easier to drive than an ordinary car. Notwithstanding the great size of these works and the extraordinary variety of the tasks performed in them, I noticed, as I had done before in many such places, the strange absence of any obvious supervision. An elaborate plan of work was first laid down. They have a special planning department here. And then the 1,001 jobs were distributed and the huge machine of production was set in motion. After that, the works almost ran themselves. Everybody knew what to do. You took something over from Bill, you did your own job on it, and then you passed it to Jack over there. And thus, motor cars seemed to flower out of cast iron, steel, aluminium, as naturally as dandelions flower in a field. Once the plan was put into action, the machinery set going, the very minimum of supervision was necessary. I said something to this effect to the young man who was showing me round, and he agreed rather ruefully that it was true. He was rueful because this method of production means that men of his kind, not mechanics but educated engineers, find fewer and fewer avenues of promotion open to them. He himself had learned the practical side of his trade as an apprentice, and the theoretical side at a university. He was an Oxford graduate, but nevertheless, though he was now 30 years of age, he was still only earning about £4 a week. He was not condemning the firm, for which he seemed to have an almost affection. It was simply that these new methods of production demanded fewer and fewer intermediaries between the 2 or 3 managers and their planning department on the one side, and the thousands of artisans on the other. The technical man with his university degree, unless he was lucky and found an opening, or had one made for him, was worse off now than the workmen themselves. At this very moment there were probably thousands of parents preparing to make heavy sacrifices in order that their boys should be turned into square pegs, when, unfortunately, industry itself is arranging that there shall be only more and more round holes. The Daimler young man who took me back to my hotel was not a Coventry man and didn't like the place. Here he was in entire agreement with the head porter of my hotel, also not a Coventry man. Perhaps there are no Coventry men, who answered my questions about a possible evening's amusement with the most sardonic negatives. It was the wrong night, it always is, to see them enjoying themselves, and anyhow they didn't enjoy themselves much. "You go into one of these pubs," he said bitterly. "All right, what do you hear? It's all about gears and magnetos and such like. Honest, that's what it's like. They can't talk about anything else. Got motor cars on the brain, they have. I hardly ever go to a pub. I go home and have a read. I went to an ugly cafe, full of bamboo and wet tables, and drank tea, while a large gramophone thundered Carmen and Tales of Hoffmann at me. Then I returned to my little box of a bedroom, which was cold and had no fireplace, and there put sheets of paper, ripe for a masterpiece, into my portable typewriter, and then, after depths of vexation, savagely tore them out again. When this had gone on for long enough, I washed myself in the chipped basin, went downstairs, and had a gin and bitters in the small room off the bar, where a barmaid with an enormous bust and a wig was busy exchanging I don't know what this word is, with her 4 friends, 2 bass, male, and 2 Guinness, female. He didn't, did he, Joe? 'S right. Caw, he never. Well, you ask Florrie. I don't know what you mean. It's right. Here, Joe, you tell her. After that, I took myself and my evening paper to the grill room. There, I had a poor meal, but made a discovery that did something to comfort me. The reason why English cookery it was allowed to lapse into barbarism was that gradually only one article of diet was taken seriously, and that is the steak. This is venerated and idealized. When an ordinary English waiter mentions any other dish, he is a realist, and his very tone of voice tells you what the dish is really like. Muck. But when he mentions steak, his voice is low, hushed, reverent. First, it is steak, the impersonal, the grand, noble viand. Then you have to be converted into giving an order, and so it's steak personal, your steak. How would you like to have your steak, sir? He's just having his steak now, sir. Here's your steak, sir. It is as if you were talking about your wife. Name any other item on the menu that is discussed in this fashion, that's even treated with the merest hint of respect. It cannot be done. We live in the empire of the steak. Centuries hence, Central Asian anthropologists will prove to one another that the bleeding steak had some religious significance in the life of this forgotten island people. Incidentally, the steak I had that night in Coventry was much too tough, and I ate far too many fried potatoes with it, so that afterwards I had to walk miles and miles into the night, and at last I came to a hill from which I had a good view of the old constellations, remotely and mildly beaming, and the new Morris Works, a power of steel and glass, flashing above the city of gears and crankshafts. And that's all I'm going to read today, but we'll carry on with From Coventry to Birmingham and then the Black Country tomorrow. So I managed to get that done in the end. Glad you made it back. Thank you, Andy Stacey. Did you neck a couple of Worthing gins? Yeah, I should have done. Bandage, humorous, witty. Thank you very much. Yeah, sometimes you come across some words that you just don't know. And of course, it's worth bearing in mind this is written in 1933. So going around, the motor car was just coming into its own, wasn't it? I mean, that's what I find really fascinating about this. The motor car and that whole thing. He describes sitting in a motor car in the previous chapter as sitting in the seat and almost disappearing into the luxury of it. Those early motor cars. And the worries that he has of mass production and the jobs that are going on in mass production over 90 years ago. I think that's absolutely fascinating. And now, of course, so much of that mass production, which is all done pretty much by some sort of machine and people interfering, it's now even more mechanically done. And we know how in the 60s and 70s, how many people were laid off as different firms were being shut down. And so, the idea of a bus that he suggests that could be turned into a caravan, and of course now we have camper vans rather, and that sort of thing. That's what I find fascinating about the descriptions in this book, because it's 90 years ago, and of course people, they were trying to get out of the depression, and there were so many people out of work, and then these factories were coming on, and it was in the eve of the Second World War. And he talks continually about the houses that have been built, the mean little houses, and not knowing, of course, that the houses are going to get a lot more meaner and have even less. And he talks about the cheap goods that are being sold, and it's interesting as he describes the hotels back then with stained wallpaper and very box-like and not even having running water. And in 90 years, what we have now, it's fascinating comparison, I think. So I'm glad people like it. I'm sure it's not everybody's cup of tea because it's not an action book by any means, but I think it's fascinating as he draws round the country, and anybody who has travelled a bit. I mean, I think the description of Coventry is fascinating because in 1933 it sounds like there was all these bits of history, and then the ring, as he calls it, this thick ring of people making bicycles and motor cars and wirelesses and contrivances of that nature. I love this old terminology. I absolutely love that old terminology. It's just getting one's head round the language is very difficult. But we know that Coventry gets obliterated, decimated. Well, more than decimated, because decimated means only 10%, doesn't it? When you say something is decimated, it actually means that 10% of it is broken or destroyed. Whereas often we use the term to think that it means everything, but actually decimated, hence decimal, only means 10% of it is destroyed. But yeah, we know that Coventry was pretty much flattened, and all that history that he's talking about has gone. And interesting, the point he made about the Cotswolds and how it should be turned into a national park because it is a very beautiful land. And of course, the National Trust was fairly early in its existence and buying up bits of land. And of course, now we know that it had, and we know that national parks do exist. The South Downs, for example, only turned into a national park, I think, in 2009. So what's that? That's sort of 70 years hence. So it is a fascinating thing, and that's why I think these books by authors who are very observant and have a certain way with words are very interesting. And when this virus business is all over, it will be fascinating to take the same journey and go to some of the same places and see in 90 years how much has changed. And he talks about Birmingham. I pre-read the chapters, so I know what's coming. I haven't read the whole book yet. I'm just a couple of chapters ahead. And it's interesting because he talks about Birmingham, and as you'll see, he starts with the grim notion that Birmingham's going to be not very pleasant. And then as he gets into Birmingham, he finds that it's more pleasant than he thought. Well, we know that Birmingham went through a number of changes, and we now know that Birmingham is a very, very different place with a very different racial set of people there than in 1933. And that would be fascinating to compare in 90 years how a place has changed so dramatically. Not saying for the better or for the worse, but just how it has changed. And that's what I think reading these books, it gives to me as somebody who's got this quest for England and what England is and where England is going. And that's not to exclude Wales and Scotland or Ireland, Northern Ireland or whatever, but England as the largest chunk of land, and being an Englishman myself, is, I suppose, what fascinates me more. Michelangelo says, if we had not done the first bombing raid on Berlin, we would have lost the war. as Hitler would have continued bombing our airfields. Well, this is absolutely, this is an interesting thing that I wanted to have this, from May onwards, I wanted to concentrate the Quest for England looking at the Battle of Britain and visiting places, visiting where aircraft had come down, thinking about how we were on the front line defending our island, how we came together, how the being civilians on the front line for the first time, the First World War, we sent our boys overseas, and we had the news coming back very slowly, and we had to take all our information from the newspapers. And the Second World War then came, and we had civilians, people living on the front line with the aeroplanes coming overhead and dropping bombs on us. And this was a massive change in how war was fought. And it's interesting to compare that with this situation where all the countries are battling to save themselves, and we're pulling together in some form or other. But unlike pulling together in the Second World War, where we can put our arms round people, strangers, pick strangers up off the ground who are desperate, we can't touch them, and we look at people in the street and move away because we're suspicious that they may have something or we may have something to give. It's a very odd juxtaposition that we're all pulling together with this terrible scourge, but at the same time we can't have any physical interaction, and we can't go out of our houses. And I think, before you could go in the Second World War 80 years ago this year, you could still have the thing that you were at war with, but you could go out of your houses and you could pull together and you could make collections, and you could put your scrap food into a bucket so the pigs could be fed, or your aluminium into containers so that they could make Spitfires and Hurricanes. And this time round, we have a foe that we're voluntarily imprisoning ourselves, which is a strange situation. But anyway, it's great. That's why history, I think, is so important, because it tells us so much about who we are and what we do and what we do naturally. And then we find ourselves in other situations and we can compare. Anyway, Audrey says, yes, you could do a trip like Michael Portello did with his book on the railways. Yes, absolutely. The programme cost an awful lot of money. Of course, they were having to house and pay for the travelling of the crew and pay for their wages as well. But one man could do that. I could do this English journey on the back of the patrons in a camper van, and could go around and visit places and do that comparison. It would be comparatively easy, and would be a lovely thing to do. And then to take chunks from the book to and the the other thing is, it's the attitude. There's something about the attitude, of the British psyche at that moment in time, which really talks to me. I think because it's just within not my living memory, but my father's living memory. In 1934, my father was born. So he was born into the world of Priestley journey, but his formative years would have been 10, 15, 20, 30 years later as he became a young man, and of course would have lived through the war. But he was born into that world, and of course, not that I had huge debates or conversations with my father about anything like that. And actually, my parents divorced when I was 10. Um, but my father and my mother, to a degree, both being brought up in that world, some of that's rubbed off onto me. Whereas my grandfather, who I didn't see a great deal at all, but if I had, probably his world would have been in the Victorian period, just at the end of the Victorian period. And his formative years, I don't know when he was born, probably 1880, 1890s or something, or 1900. You know, if my father was born in 34, then about 1900, let's say, my father's father, my grandfather would probably have been, let's say, 30 for the sake of argument. So you could then sort of work out that he must have been born in 1870 or something. So he would have lived in the Victorian period, and had witnessed the First World War, and but nothing of that has rubbed off. But it would have rubbed off a bit on my dad, and then been moulded, and then what he saw has been rubbed off on me, and then, you know, parts of this world which rubbed off on me is not rubbing off on my children in conversations, but there'll be essences of it, and I think that's where ancestry is interesting, because each one of you are taking something, reforming it, and then passing it on through the genes and through conversation and learned experiences. So I think that's fascinating. Sorry, I didn't mean to get into a discussion on all of that. I'm just sort of speculating and theorising, I suppose. Mark says Richard could do a series of video diaries and edit them into a video during his trips. Absolutely, yeah, that would be good. Audrey says, I didn't expect it, all those stripy jackets and bright trousers. On what's his name series, on Michael Portello series. I haven't got a television, so I haven't really seen all of those, but I could take a view on YouTube when I've got a bit of time. Anyway, I think that's it. I desperately need to go to the bathroom and empty my bladder, because it's still cold in here. Did this actually... No, it is on. It's just it's very cold in this back room today. All right, thank you so much. I will be live this evening at 8 o'clock on the Vobe Show channel. There'll be a video coming up this afternoon on the Bald Explorer channel, second video. And then I've got some other bits and pieces to get on with. So I have managed now to lift my black mood. I'm sorry that the earlier reading didn't work terribly well, but I managed to stagger through it this afternoon. So there we go. All right, thank you so much. I'll catch up with you later. Have a good afternoon. Bye for now. Bye-bye.